Hello, my name is Catherine Costo, and I'm the Executive Director of the Albany County Historical Association, Tenbrook Mansion. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. This is the first in our series of this program, Extraordinary Art, Scenes of Everyday Life in Albany. Program is a story of two families who loved each other, and they loved one another, and their interconnections bring us a rare insight into the lives of African Americans in Albany. The first love story is this man, Edwinvecta. He was born in 1854 in South Branch, New Jersey, to a family proud of their Dutch heritage. Edwin and his brother were entrepreneurs, and they relocated to Troy, working for the Troy Malleable Iron Company as a secretary and treasurer. Edwinvecta was dedicated to his church, which was the Second Presbyterian Church in Troy, and he taught Sunday school there. He also served as an elder. He and his family occupied a number of family homes on 19th Street in Watervliet. It was at church that Edwin met the love of his life, this woman. He was 43 years old, she just 24. According to their daughter, he met her, she was wearing a red dress and she sang a beautiful soprano role. He was completely captivated. He married this woman, Mary Cornelia Hollister, just a few months later in that same church, and they had two daughters shortly thereafter. Edwin was described as a very loving, involved father, and you can certainly see that from this photograph. These are his two daughters, Helen and Adeline. The family later moved to California and had additional children. Edwin was described as having unswerving devotion to the principles of justice and right. So how does this apply to people who worked in their household? They always had family photos. They always had family gatherings. Here's an example of the 19th Street home. But it's not just the house, it's everyone gathered on the porch. And the Vectas also had somewhat candid shots. They took photos of people at work. They took photos of a woman named Josie, who was a nurse as well as midwife. And among their family photos were preserved a set of glass plate negatives. And this one has a label written on it. Hannah, I think, who lived with Dada's family. Years is added on, and above it in pencil very faintly is older handwriting that says, quote, colored lady. Who is Hannah, and how does she relate to the Vecta family? This is one of the images in their collection, so there's one print and one glass negative. This is the print. Which of these women is Hannah? We don't know. We do know that this was Edwinvecta back here, but who are these people? Which one is Hannah, and what's the relationship to one another? So I began a search. I started broadly, starting with what I did know, a name Hannah, and an approximate time period. I had about 300 names of women named Hannah, and I began to eliminate based on date, based on marriage, based on family connections, and I started to come up with the strongest candidates. This was one of the final candidates, but I ended up thinking it was not likely the Hannah in this photograph. This is a census record for Hannah Phillip or Phillipsa and her husband, Grenville Phillipsa. Hannah is listed as a wife, he's listed as a head of household, and his occupation is listed as boatswain, which is basically the captain of a boat or of a ship in the Hudson River. So her husband was part of the African-American middle class in Albany, a highly skilled occupation that connected the worlds of trade, transportation, and economics. But based on their age, they were about 20 years too old. They only had one surviving child out of 5. I did not think it was likely that they were the Hannah in this photograph. This was the family that I think is the strongest candidate for being the same as the Hannah in the photograph that we looked at just earlier. Her name is Hannah Vandeveer, and her husband's name is Michael. You can see that they have 2 children, Ella, who's already listed even at age 9 as a servant. And they have a son named Frank, who's age 16. He doesn't have an occupation, but the entire family was literate, so it's likely that he could have been in school. Hannah's husband has a very interesting occupation, again, identifying him as part of the African-American middle class in Albany. He's a sexton, not of a cemetery, but of a church. And what did sextons do? Church sextons in particular. They had a legal role. In many cases, they were involved with filing documents, ascertaining certain records for the county and the city. They also had the role of caretaker, of curator, of custodian, ensuring that all went well in a church, assuring that monies were deposited with treasurers. So it was a very responsible position. And again, he's part of the African-American middle class in Albany. They lived on Canvas Street in Cohoes. And let's go to where they lived. So here's Canvas Street. They lived right up here. And you can see it's a very good location to be in. Like most 19th century locations in Albany County, it's a very walkable neighborhood. They can easily get to the train depot, which is just a bit further away from their house. And here is their house on Canvas Street. So this is where they lived, right here. Again, you can see it's very centrally located. There's a number of pharmacies, telegraph office, tailor, barber. There is a boarding house and there are tenants here. We do know they rented, but this is their house. They're near a number of the mills. And again, the depot is just about a minute's walk from their house. And here's an image of that, as well as the churches in the background. Cohoes was known as the city of churches. And why is that? It had 14 churches for a population of just about 23,000 in 1900. So why so many churches? Cohoes has always had a very diverse population. You have Yankees, New Englanders who settled there, the Dutch. You also have increasing groups of immigrants, Italian, Irish, Eastern Europeans settling in Cohoes, each building their own church. So if you're a church sexton, again, a very good place to live. And here's the block just to the south of where they live. And you can see all along here, St. Bernard's Roman Catholic Church, a Episcopal church, a Reformed church. So there's a lot of opportunities. I don't know exactly which church he was at, so that's part of the ongoing research. But again, he's very centrally located. And looking again at this photograph, so we now know that most likely this man's name is Michael, and this is probably Hannah right here. These are the 2 children that we see in the census record. And here are 2 additional children not included in that record because it's between the census years. It's possible that they are Ella's daughters, but I think it's more likely that Hannah had additional children. A little bit more about Michael's background. Vandeveer is a fairly unusual name. It's a Dutch name, and we do see that Vandeveers are actually slave traders in the 17th century and actually had a ship that they put a claim in regarding the enslaved persons who were on that ship. But you don't have a lot of Vandeveers in the United States or the colonies at all, but we do have this one record. This is a later 19th century copy of a record from 1821. in which it is a record of a Black woman named Mary, who had a male child named Josh. And again, based on the dates, based on locations, and what we do know about the Vandeveers and Coes, it is very likely that Mary is Michael's grandmother and Josh is his father. So it's very likely that his father was born into slavery. And what about Hannah's life? What was her life like? Well, employment opportunities were changing for African-American women in Albany County in the 1880s. As I mentioned, Cohoes is a city of immigrants, and there's increasing immigration. So there's increasing competition for jobs that African-American women had held, such as household manager. This is another one of the Vecta family photos, and you can see that sense of they just captured life as it unfolded around them. On the back of this, it's written, German girl who worked for us. And this young woman is in traditional German dress called a dirndl. She probably didn't wear it every day, and you can kind of see from the smile on her face, there's a sense of friendliness and playfulness. She's probably dressed up. She would have brought this with her as she immigrated from Germany, and it would have been worn on special occasions. So she's, showing the family her special dress. But German women were competing for jobs with African-American women. And you can see from these wanted ads in Albany, increasingly, there was coded language excluding African-American women from employment. So wanted, a German girl to cook, wash, and iron. Wanted, a German. For rent, a large, finely furnished first-class saloon. German preferred. Situation wanted by a respectable German girl as cook. So increasingly, African-American women are pushed out of occupations in Albany County in the 1880s. And you really see the rise of this type of ad from about 1884 to about 1900. So that's the period that the Vectas are taking photographs of Hannah. So Hannah is part of their family. She's employed by them, of course. She's their household manager, but she's in a climate that's increasingly inhospitable to African-American women. So again, returning to this one negative, what can we learn about this image and how Hannah fit into the Vecta family? Well, again, we see the note, but the note is written well after the fact. Let's go to the original sources to see how did photography function in the Vecta household. Now, it's certainly not an iPhone where you can snap 100 pictures before you realized it. But all things considered, the Vectas had a pretty casual approach to photography. They really did capture their everyday life. And here's a self-portrait that he made, or perhaps he had someone to push the shutter for him. So Edwin is posed here. You can see it's a little bit awkward. The camera's on a tripod. It really can't be adjusted too much. And it's a little bit awkward. It's not like you would see in a studio portrait. But you can see there he is, his hands folded. He's just capturing a photograph of himself. And the family did keep meticulous records. The glass plate negatives had sleeves that they were placed in, and then they were developed. And you can see they would keep records, the date that it was made, who was in the particular image. The glass plates are 4" by 5", and they are not a wet process, but they're a dry process plate. So it's a gelatin coating, and it's a little bit more stable and easier to work with. This type of photography really started to proliferate in the 1880s to the 1920s. It's not as easy as a Brownie camera. It's certainly not an iPhone, but it's a much easier process where you start to see some really enthusiastic people, generally middle class, upper middle class, who would experiment with a camera like this. So it really you start to see the rise of almost snapshots in casual images, which you never saw before in the history of photography. And here's a likely camera that Edwin used. This particular model was used between 1889 and 1889 and 1901, and it was made by the Greenpoint Optical Company. So this was likely the type of camera that he used. So you can see it's about the size of a loaf of bread, put on a tripod. So it's a little awkward to bring around the house, but you could certainly capture everyday photos. And everyday photos we find. So here it is. Here is the photograph that was on the glass plate negative. To our knowledge, this is the first time this image has ever been seen in 110 years. I used a digital process to develop the glass plate negative. Here is Hannah. And what can we learn about Hannah? Well, we know for this particular photo, it's very likely and almost certain this was taken right behind the Vecta's family home. You can see these are very new clapboards. There's really not much paint on them. So it's their new home. You also look at these shrubberies, these plantings, they're very new. So their house was just built, and here she is behind the house. Very similar pose to Edwin. You can also see how the camera lens blurs the hands a little bit. The resolution on the lens probably wasn't perfect. But I think what's also very striking in this image is Hannah's expression. There's a sense that she can relax, that she can smile, perhaps even a little bit bemused in this photo. The fact that the family saved these images, that Hannah agreed to have her photograph taken, that she has a pretty relaxed, happy look on her face, I think shows that perhaps Edwin had just asked her, well, what about if I take a picture of your entire family? And I think we can say, as we see from the photo that we have, that she said yes. Harvard historian Tyra Miles has written a book, All That She Carried, using one artifact to write an entire book about an African-American family. And this study of Hannah's family in these two photographs show how much can be gleaned just from these precious survivals. And while we don't know certainly if this Hannah is the same as the Hannah and Michael in Cohoes, or perhaps even Hannah who lived in Albany, the Phillips family, the search to uncover that history, as Tyra Miles writes, is part of the story itself. Local history is important. If you have family documents, please save them, share your research, share the lives of other people that you may uncover. If you find a drawer full of photos that you don't recognize, please don't throw them away. All of these are part of someone's family records. Together, we are illuminating the stories of African Americans in our community, and together we are illuminating the stories of everyone. Thank you.